High Commissioner, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege and a great honor for me to open the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. The first regular session of the year is in many ways the main session of this Council, which in its turn is the most important forum of the United Nations Human Rights Pillar. And this 46th session is particularly special as the first almost entirely virtual regular session of the Council. By continuing to meet at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic shows no signs of abating, the Human Rights Council fulfills the collective responsibility to continue upholding human rights standards and to respond to the human rights challenges exacerbated by times of crisis. We will begin this session by listening to statements by the President of the 75th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, and the Federal Counselor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis, representing the host country. I wish to take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to all delegations and other stakeholders who are participating in this session of the Council. Due to the prevailing sanitary conditions and the extraordinary modalities for this session, the 15 LDC's SIDS selected beneficiary delegates, supported by the LDC's SIDS Trust Fund, are not able to participate in this session in person. However, 2 virtual induction sessions on the Council's work were organized with simultaneous interpretation on the 15th and 16th of February to ensure that they receive timely information to engage with the Council ahead of this session. Over 65 government officials, mostly capital-based, from 26 LDC's SIDS, including 4 without a permanent mission in Geneva, attended the induction sessions. We are looking forward to their active virtual participation during this 46th session. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, before I give the floor to today's high-level speakers, let us turn our attention to the proposed extraordinary modalities for this session. As announced at the organizational meeting on 8th February, the Bureau has recommended that the extraordinary modalities for participation in the 46th session would be similar to those applied during the 36th and 37th sessions of the UPR Working Group. The minutes of the Bureau meeting of 18th February provided detailed information about the proposed extraordinary modalities to be applied at the 46th session. Allow me to recall the proposed extraordinary modalities for the 46th session as detailed in the annex of the minutes of the Bureau meeting of the 18th of February for consideration by the Council. The number of delegates in the Assembly Hall would be managed in order not to exceed the limit of 5 delegates being present at the same time. The high-level segment of the 46th session would take place virtually, whereby the statements of dignitaries would be delivered by pre-recorded video statements in a similar manner to the high-level segment of the 75th session of the General Assembly. State delegations would be strongly encouraged to send pre-recorded video statements. In the case of interactive dialogues and panel discussions, or when pre-recorded video statements would not be technically possible or could not be submitted within the set deadline, states could alternatively deliver their statements through live link via the Zoom platform. Only those state delegations who are unable to pre-record video messages or participate via Zoom could exceptionally deliver their statements from the Assembly Hall, while also respecting the 5-person limit and in consultation with the HRC Secretariat. Delegations would be able to raise points of order without being in the room by raising their hands in Zoom, which will be recognized by the Secretariat at the podium. The chair would then stop the debate and give the floor through the Zoom platform to the delegation that has raised the point of order. Delegations would be able to exercise their rights of reply remotely, in the same manner as during the 45th regular session. The Secretariat would register the request and inform the representative of the estimated time for the right of reply segment. The representative will then be called upon during the right of reply segment in the order of the requests received. Side events cannot take place inside the Palais des Nations during the 46th session. If NGOs decide to organize virtual events in parallel to the 46th session, information on such events could be listed on the OHCHR Civil Society webpage, along with a statement indicating that the events are not Council events and are the sole responsibility of their organizers. Delegations would be invited to organize their informal consultations and group meetings virtually. Delegations needing assistance in setting up virtual informal consultations and group meetings would be invited to contact the relevant focal point within the Council Secretariat. Information on the informal meetings would be included on SCED, including the name of a focal point from one of the main sponsors. The same health and safety measures that were applied during the 45th regular session of the Human Rights Council and the 36th and 37th sessions of the UPR Working Group would continue to be applied in a very strict manner. Additionally, I am also proposing that the Council adopt a decision according to which, given the current exceptional circumstances related to COVID-19, NGOs in consultative status with ECOSOC and national human rights institutions with A status would be invited to submit pre-recorded video statements for general debates, as well as for interactive dialogues, panel discussions, and UPR adoptions during the 46th session, during the period when COVID-19 restrictions prohibit public meetings of more than 5 participants. In order to balance the importance of inclusivity and what is feasible in terms of time and resources, the list of speakers for NGOs for each of the general debates would be set in line with the average number of NGOs that participated in each of the general debates in the previous 3 March sessions of the Council. Moreover, NGOs would be provided the opportunity to indicate their priority when making their registration in order to ensure placement in their preferred general debates. Should the modalities be adopted, this would be referred to as a decision in the report of the session. These extraordinary modalities would apply exclusively to the 46th regular session, during the period when COVID-19 restrictions prohibit public meetings of more than 5 participants and should not serve as a precedent. Concerning the voting process, I understand that this is of great concern to delegations in light of the current situation. Please be assured that the Bureau remains seized of this issue. As you would have seen in the minutes of the Bureau meeting of 18th February, the Secretariat is exploring and testing several options for virtual voting for the 46th session in the event that the current limitations on in-person participation continue through to the 23rd of March. The most suitable options will be presented to the Bureau in the coming days and will thereafter be presented to the Council members for their consideration. I assure you that delegations will be consulted and that no decisions will be taken in this regard without the agreement of this Council. On a final note, as you know, I have held extensive consultations over the past 2 weeks with all regional and other groups, as well as with civil society. During these consultations, a common and recurring concern was expressed by delegations in relation to the lack of real-time interpretation in all 6 languages on the Zoom platform. Subsequent to these consultations, I sent a letter on behalf of the Bureau to the Acting Assistant Secretary General for Information and Communications Technology to request that the United Nations Secretariat allow the Council to use the Zoom platform with the possibility to channel interpretation in all 6 languages as soon as possible. I am extremely pleased to announce that last Friday night I received a response from the Assistant Secretary General, in which he approved our request and exceptionally authorized the use of the Zoom platform to support specifically the Council's 46th session. Indeed, this would mean that all participants and delegations would have access to real-time interpretation in all 6 languages in the Zoom platform. We are extremely pleased with this development, and we will continue our engagement with the respective UNOG officers to ensure that we are able to implement the Zoom platform with interpretation in all 6 languages as soon as practically possible. I continue to ask for your patience and understanding and your continued support for the upcoming session. Are there any delegations wishing to take the floor on the proposed modalities for the 46th session? I see none. Can I take it then that the Council agrees with the proposed modalities? I see no objection. It is so decided. I now move to reprisals. The active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions in the work of the Human Rights Council is essential to the fulfillment of its mandate. As President of this Council, I can assure you that I will follow up on all allegations brought to my attention of acts of reprisal and intimidation committed against persons in connection to their contribution to the work of the Human Rights Council, its mechanisms and procedures. I call on everyone to take all necessary measures to prevent such acts in the first place and to ensure that they are promptly and seriously addressed in case they were to happen. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I now have the honor to give the floor to the President of the 75th session of the General Assembly.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank you, Madam President, for inviting me to address the Human Rights Council today. I also avail of this opportunity to congratulate you on your election. Having advocated for gender equality, justice and transparency as both a jurist and diplomat, I am sure that you will continue to champion these values throughout your term. I hope that the membership will also look to you to learn more about the experience of Fijians as the climate crisis continues to affect the human rights of people around the world, particularly in small island developing states and least developed countries. Excellencies, 75 years ago, the world experienced devastation which fractured trust between nations. The people of the world were left divided and despondent. However, visionary leaders envisaged a path forward. The penholders of the Charter of the United Nations believed that all was not lost. A multilateral system, supported by robust institutions and underpinned by the protection of and respect for human rights, would benefit all nations in its primary quest for peace and security. Just 3 years later, the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Landmark human rights conventions followed, and the Human Rights Council, a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, was created in 2006. However, the fact remains that although human rights and fundamental freedoms are universal and inherent in every person, in practice they are not universally protected, and perpetrators of human rights abuses are too often not held to account. We have spent decades building a multilateral system strong enough to meet global challenges, but there is more work left to do. This is especially pertinent today, as the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a veil behind which more human rights abuses are being committed. For example, meetings in hybrid format. I'm proud that both the General Assembly and the Council stepped up to continue its vital work to deliver their mandates at a crucial juncture in history. As I have said before, this pandemic is not just a health crisis, it's also a human rights crisis. It is essential that all responses to the COVID-19 pandemic are centered around human rights and promote the protection of our citizens, including the most vulnerable, who need our care and consideration the most. This includes ensuring the equal and fair distribution of vaccines for all. It is critical that civil society, the private sector, and all stakeholders are facilitated to participate and provide feedback throughout the planning and assessment of responses. Excellencies, we have 9 years left to meet the targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Make no mistake, sustainable development and human rights are symbiotic. We simply cannot make gains in one area if we neglect the other. Because to leave no one behind means upholding the rights of everyone, everywhere. As an international gender champion, I firmly believe that progress on SDG 5, gender equality, will create lasting change in society. Gender equality will enable us to implement sustainable development and uphold the rights and dignity of all individuals around the world. I applaud your engagement in the Third Human Rights Council intersessional meeting of the SDGs and human rights held on January 14th. I trust that all organs of the United Nations system took note of the concrete examples of how a rights-based approach will pave the way for a sustainable recovery for all. Indeed, such interactions between the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, and the Human Rights Council will serve to benefit all areas of work and make serious gains in this decade of action to implement sustainable development. Excellencies, 3/4 of a century ago, we the peoples entrusted the United Nations to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. It is, to be sure, a tall order, but it is a clear directive. It is our duty to fully respect human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law in times of peace, pandemic, conflict, and crisis. To this end, I applaud your practice of special sessions to respond to situations requiring urgent attention, addressing most recently the issue of arbitrary detention and restrictions on the human rights to freedom of association and peaceful assembly. The onus lies on us to create the United Nations we need for the future we want. We need to emulate the ambition shown by those who became before us, 3/4 ago of a century. The world needs you to step up and tackle the most difficult human rights crisis facing humanity in all regions. I trust that you will continue to improve inclusion throughout your work on the issues which affect the people we represent here at the United Nations. You can count on the full support of the General Assembly throughout the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I now have the honor to give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Distinguished President of the Human Rights Council, Madam High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Human rights are our bloodline. They connect us to one another as equals. Human rights are our lifeline. They are the pathway to resolving tensions and forging lasting peace. And human rights are on the front line. They are the building blocks of a world of dignity and opportunity for all, and they are under fire every day. The Human Rights Council is the global locus for tackling the full range of human rights challenges. I thank you for that vital work and welcome the engagement of member states and civil society. 1 year ago, I came before you to launch a call to action for human rights. We named this values-based and dignity-driven appeal the highest aspiration, drawing from the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. That phrase is a reminder that securing human rights is both essential and a constant work in progress. Gains can be easily undone. Perils can strike in any instant. Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, soon after gathering last year, COVID-19 hit the world without mercy. The pandemic revealed the interconnectedness of our human family and of the full spectrum of human rights: civil, cultural, economic, political, and social. COVID-19 has deepened pre-existing divides, vulnerabilities, and inequalities, as well as opened up new fractures, including fault lines in human rights. We are seeing a vicious circle of violations. The lives of hundreds of millions of families have been turned upside down, with lost jobs, mounting debt, and steep falls in income. The disease has taken a disproportionate toll on women, minorities, persons with disabilities, older persons, refugees, migrants, and Indigenous peoples. Progress on gender equality has been set back years. Extreme poverty is rising for the first time in decades. Young people are struggling, out of school and often with limited access to technology. The latest moral outrage is the failure to ensure equity in vaccination efforts. Just 10 countries have administered 75% of all COVID-19 vaccines. Vaccine equity affirms human rights. Vaccine nationalism denies it. Vaccines must be a global public good, accessible and affordable for all. The virus is also infecting political and civil rights and further shrinking civic space. Using the pandemic as a pretext, authorities in some countries have deployed heavy-handed security responses and emergency measures to crush dissent, criminalise basic freedoms, silence independent reporting, and curtail the activities of non-governmental organisations. Human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, political activists, and even medical professionals are being detained, prosecuted, and subjected to intimidation and surveillance for criticising government pandemic responses, or the lack thereof. Pandemic-related restrictions are being used to subvert electoral processes, weaken opposition voices, and suppress criticism. At times, access to life-saving COVID-19 information has been concealed, while deadly misinformation has been amplified, including by those in power.
More generally, about the growing reach of digital platforms and the use and abuse of data. A vast library of information is being assembled about each of us, yet we don't really have the keys to that library. We don't know how this information has been collected, by whom, or for what purposes. That data is being used commercially, for advertising, for marketing, and for beefing up corporate bottom lines. Behavior patterns are being commodified and sold like futures contracts. And this has created new business models and entirely new industries that have contributed to an ever greater concentration of wealth and inequality. Our data is also being used to shape and manipulate our perceptions without our ever realizing it. Governments can exploit that data to control the behavior of their own citizens, violating human rights of individuals or groups. All of this is not science fiction or a forecast of a 22nd century dystopia. It is here and now. And it requires a serious discussion. We have developed a roadmap for digital cooperation to find a way forward. And I urge all member states to place human rights at the center of regulatory frameworks and legislation on the development and use of digital technologies. We need a safe, equitable, and open digital future that does not infringe on privacy or dignity. Excellencies, our human rights call to action is a comprehensive framework to advance our most important work, from sustainable development to climate action, from protecting fundamental freedoms to gender equality, the preservation of civic space, and ensuring that digital technology is a force for good. Today, I come before you with a sense of urgency to do even more to bring our human rights call to action to life. I want to focus on two areas where the imperative for action is great and the scale of the challenge looms large. First, the blight of racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. And second, the most pervasive human rights violation of all, gender inequality. These evils are fed by two of the deepest wells of injustice in our world, the legacy of centuries of colonialism and the persistence across the millennia of patriarchy. The linkages between racism and gender inequality are also unmistakable. Some of the worst impacts of both are in the overlaps and intersections of discrimination suffered by women from racial and ethnic minority groups. Stoking the fires of racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, violence against some minority Christian communities, homophobia, xenophobia, and misogyny is nothing new. It has just become more overt, easier to achieve, and globalized. When we allow the denigration of any of us, we set the precedent for the demonization of all of us. Excellencies, the rot of racism eats away at institutions, social structures, and everyday life, sometimes invisibly and insidiously. I welcome the new awakening in the global fight for racial justice, a surge of resistance against being reduced or ignored, often led by women and young people. As they have highlighted, we have a long way to go. I commend the Human Rights Council decision to report on systemic racism, accountability and redress, and responses to peaceful anti-racism protests, and look forward to concrete action. We must also step up the fight against resurgent neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and racially and ethnically motivated terrorism. The danger of these hate-driven movements is growing by the day. Let us call them what they are. White supremacy and neo-Nazi movements are more than domestic terror threats. They are becoming a transnational threat. These and other groups have exploited the pandemic to boost their ranks through social polarization and political and cultural manipulation. Today, these extremist movements represent the #1 internal security threat in several countries. Individuals and groups are engaged in a feeding frenzy of hate, fundraising, recruiting, and communicating online, both at home and overseas, traveling internationally to train together and network their hateful ideologies. Far too often, these hate groups are cheered on by people in positions of responsibility in ways that were considered unimaginable not long ago. We need global coordinated action to defeat this grave and growing danger. Excellencies, we must also place a special focus on safeguarding the rights of minority communities, many of whom are under threat around the world. Minority communities are part of the richness of our cultural and social fabric. Just as biodiversity is fundamental to human well-being, the diversity of communities is fundamental to humanity. Yet, we see not only forms of discrimination, but also policies of assimilation that seek to wipe out the cultural and religious identity of minority communities. When a minority community's culture, language, or faith are under attack, all of us are diminished. When authorities cast suspicion on entire groups under the guise of security, all of us are threatened. These measures are doomed to backfire. We must continue to push for policies that fully respect human rights and religious, cultural, and unique human identity. And we must simultaneously nurture the conditions for each community to feel that they are fully part of society as a whole. Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants.
Excellencies, no human rights scourge is more prevalent than gender inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated entrenched discrimination against women and girls. The crisis has a woman's face. Most essential frontline workers are women, many from racially and ethnically marginalized groups at the bottom of the economic ladder. Most of the increased burden of care in the home is taken on by women. Violence against women and girls in all forms has skyrocketed, from online abuse to domestic violence, trafficking, sexual exploitation, and child marriage. Women have suffered higher job losses and have been pushed into poverty in greater numbers. This is on top of already fragile socio-economic conditions due to lower incomes, the wage gap, and a lifetime of less access to opportunities, resources, and protections. None of this happened by accident. It is the result of generations of exclusion. It comes down to a question of power. A male-dominated world and a male-dominated culture will yield male-dominated results. At the same time, the COVID-19 response has highlighted the power and effectiveness of women's leadership. The lives of women are perhaps one of the most accurate barometers of the health of society as a whole. How a society treats half of its own population is a significant indicator of how it will treat others. Our rights are inextricably bound. That is why, as a proud feminist, I have delivered on my commitment to make gender parity a reality in the leadership of the United Nations. And I have made gender equality a leading priority for the organization as a whole. This is not just the responsibility of any individual or agency. If we are to be an inclusive, credible, and effective international organization, it is the work of everyone. I am committed to doing much more. Our call to action on human rights has a specific emphasis on repealing all discriminatory laws globally and on achieving women's equal right to participation and representation in every sector and at every level through ambitious actions, including temporary special measures such as quotas. Realizing this right will benefit all of us. The opportunity of man-made problems, and I choose these words deliberately, is that they have human-led solutions. But these solutions can only be found through shared leadership and decision-making and the right to equal participation.
Excellencies, every corner of the globe is suffering from the sickness of violations of human rights. Of course, there are a number of extremely concerning country situations, some of them very prolonged, and this is where the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms are so vital in raising awareness, protecting people, maintaining dialogue, and finding solutions. I thank the Human Rights Council for your recent and timely focus on a situation where the challenges that I outlined today are dramatically evident, and that is the case of Myanmar. we see the undermining of democracy, the use of brutal force, arbitrary arrests, repression in all its manifestations, restrictions of civic space, attacks on civil society, serious violations against minorities with no accountability, including what was rightly being called ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya population. The list goes on. It is all coming together in a perfect storm of upheaval. Today, I call on the Myanmar military to stop the repression immediately, release the prisoners, end the violence, respect human rights and the will of the people expressed in recent elections. Coups have no place in our modern world. I welcome the resolution of the Human Rights Council, pledged to implement your requests, and express my full support to the people of Myanmar in their pursuit of democracy, peace, human rights, and the rule of law. Excellencies, people around the world are relying on us to secure and protect their rights. With the pandemic shining a spotlight on human rights, recovery gives us an opportunity to generate momentum for transformation. Now is the time to reset, to reshape, to rebuild, to recover better, guided by human rights and human dignity for all. I am convinced it is possible if we are determined and if we work together. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Secretary General, President of the General Assembly, President of the Human Rights Council, Excellencies, friends. Last year brought us an exceptionally clear picture of our countries, communities, and world. The pandemic ripped the mask of the deadly realities of discrimination, deep inequalities, and chronic underfunding for essential services and rights, all largely ignored by many policymakers. It demonstrated how severely the neglect of human rights endangers societies. And it also showed us the profound protective value of human rights-based approaches. Today, the medical impact of the pandemic is far from over, and its effects on economies, freedoms, societies, and people have only just begun. The global rise in extreme poverty, accelerating inequalities, setbacks to women's rights and equality, to education and opportunities for children and young people, and to the Sustainable Development Agenda are shocks that could shake the foundations of societies. We must now urgently act on the Clarity of 2020 vision as we face year 2 of COVID-19. To combat the pandemic, we need to acknowledge and repair the fractures that have undermined the resilience of our societies. We need to prepare our recovery because now, as states extend massive efforts to shore up and rebuild, we have the possibility of rebuilding better, more inclusive systems which address root causes and prepare us to meet the challenges we will certainly face. This means prioritizing the construction or reinforcement of systems to deliver the right to health and the right to social protection, vital investments in social support for all that in many cases have been corroded by decades of austerity. It means eliminating every form of discrimination, the costly, humiliating, unprincipled, and entirely counterproductive systems and stereotypes which harm health, generate injustice, and prevent women, people from ethnic, religious, or caste minorities, and many others from contributing to society in full enjoyment of their rights. It means encouraging meaningful public participation to build policies that are more effective because they are grounded in people's realities and needs. It means marshalling the full operational capacity of every UN body to support states working in solidarity to uphold good governance, the right to development, democracy, and all other human rights. Because I think we all realize that the use of force will not end this pandemic. Sending critics to jail will not end this pandemic. Illegitimate restrictions on public freedoms, the overreach of emergency powers, and unnecessary or excessive use of force are not just unhelpful and unprincipled. They deter public participation in decision-making, which is the foundation of sound policymaking. What will end this pandemic and accelerate a durable and resilient recovery is the effective application of human rights principles based on public trust. And to build trust, there must be transparent, accountable, and inclusive government, grounded in a free press, effective democratic institutions, and the public's meaningful participation in policy. I am convinced that every country, as well as the UN and other international partners, should be investing in much stronger support for these essential pillars, as well as for genuinely free and independent civil society organizations. Excellencies, over the past year, we have been fortunate to be able to count on the Secretary General's determined support, and particularly the call to action for human rights framework, which he has presented at this council a year ago. This has been a remarkably timely roadmap for our work with states and UN partners, highlighting women's equality, a broad participative civic space, and the rights of young people and future generations. Over the past year, our office has engaged with our partners in well over 90 states to provide detailed, practical, and targeted guidance for country response and preparedness policies. We have developed an extensive body of guidance, human rights indicators, and a checklist for a human rights-based approach to socioeconomic country responses to guide the work of UN country teams. We have increased our capacity and support to states on economic recovery strategies, including options to better curb inequalities and get back on track to meet the SDGs by expanding the physical space. But this is not just about OHCHR's efforts. I ask member states to take a clear look at their own record in terms of the real impact of their efforts to end discrimination, redress inequalities, and ensure that all the people have the freedom to participate fully in decisions. With despair and suffering escalating in every region, now is the time to bring people real hope that there will be swift, meaningful, and positive change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now have the honor of inviting His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, to make a statement on behalf of the host country. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President of the Human Rights Council, Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Madam High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished ministers, distinguished delegates. Do you remember? We met in the Palais des Nations. The room was full. The opening statement was cordial and warm. You could start to think that it happened in the distant past, and yet it was not so long ago, just a year ago. Together we opened the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council here in Geneva, all in the same room. Today, things would be different. The COVID-19 pandemic has turned our lives upside down and placed new challenges before us. In all regions of the world, we see an increase in inequality and discrimination. The progress made under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is now under threat. The efforts needed to improve this and to move forward is considerable. At the same time, the pandemic has shown us to what degree our individual freedoms are dear to us. Very often we have found ourselves deprived of possibilities that seemed something to be taken for granted, meeting people, hugging them, crossing borders, travelling. The pandemic has made these basic freedoms into a central concern. We are fighting for our freedom of movement, but also for the right to life, health and education. For minorities and vulnerable groups, the pandemic comes at a heavy cost in terms not only of health, but also in economic and social terms. It is all the more important for the more fragile among us to be able to have their voices heard and have access to information. Freedom of access to reliable information is crucial if, as a society, we want to right the challenges of the day. Journalists must be able to carry out their task without fearing reprisals or fearing for their lives, and ideas and solutions must circulate freely. I would like to commend the tireless commitment of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations, who have provided useful information to countries in combating the pandemic, while mobilizing to protect human rights in these difficult times. The crisis has brought us closer together. Today, we are better able to understand that we need to work together. Given global challenges, the response must be planetary. It is not a question only of overcoming the crisis, but also looking to the future. It is time to define the outlines of a post-COVID world, and the 2030 Agenda provides the perfect framework. It shows clearly that without fundamental freedoms, no sustainable development is possible. Ladies and gentlemen, things that concern all of us can only be resolved by all of us, said the Swiss writer Friedrich Dürrenmatt, who would have celebrated his 100th birthday this year, and they are all the more relevant. A collective problem can only be sustainably resolved if everybody provides part of the response for a common solution. The United Nations has a key role to play. Switzerland welcomes the fact that the United Nations institutions have been able to continue their activities even during the pandemic. The Human Rights Council in particular has shown its resilience and has been able to respond in agile fashion to events, adapting its working methods. In the volatile, complex context of today, this flexibility is essential. Solutions to global challenges cannot be left only to states and international organizations. The private sector and civil society are part of inclusive multilateralism. They are part of the solution. They contribute to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. This cooperation and these exchanges have their proper place in the August Forum of the Human Rights Council. I warmly invite you to participate actively in creating the world of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to open the high-level segment of this 46th session. It is scheduled to conclude on Wednesday and will be followed by the general segment. Allow me to recall that, as in the past and in conformity with the Council's rules and practices, there is no possibility to interrupt a dignitary statement by way of a point of order. All requests to exercise the right of reply relating to statements delivered during the high-level segment will be accommodated following the general segment. I wish to remind delegations that the length of a dignitary statement should not exceed 7 minutes. I also wish to underscore that unless the Secretariat receives videos in good time, we will have no other choice than to automatically reschedule those speakers for the following day. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Shavkat Mirziyoyev, President of Uzbekistan. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Distinguished President, Madam Najat Shamim Khan. Distinguished High Commissioner, Madam Michelle Bachelet. Ladies and gentlemen, today Uzbekistan is participating in this meeting for the first time as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It should be noted that in recent years we have been consciously pursuing this goal. Our democratic reforms have become irreversible and are aimed at establishing a new Uzbekistan. We are committed to continuing close cooperation with the member states of the Council and all our partners in advancing the initiative of the United Nations, a call for action for human rights. Distinguished participants of the session, I would like to outline the priorities for further enhancing the democratic transformations in Uzbekistan and our work in the framework of the Council. First, ensuring that fundamental human rights and freedoms remain central in reforming Uzbekistan. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development shall be implemented in our country in accordance with the United Nations principle of leaving no one behind to ensure the rights and lawful interests of every person. This is the implementation of the National Human Rights Strategy, in the preparation of which experts from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have actively participated. Secondly, in the issues of gender policy, we intend radically to increase the role of women in the public, political, and business life of our country, Uzbekistan. This year, we are planning to hold a Women Leaders Dialogue of Central Asian states and a regional women's business forum in Uzbekistan. Third, special priority shall be given to ensuring the rights of persons with special needs. A new law on the rights of persons with disabilities has recently come into force in our country. In the near future, the Parliament of Uzbekistan will ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We also propose to establish a regional council on the self-realization of persons with disabilities. Fourth, the protection of the rights of young people who make up more than half of the population of Uzbekistan is constantly the focus of our attention. This year in our country, it has been declared the year of supporting youth and strengthening public health. We are preparing to hold the World Conference on Youth Rights under United Nations auspices to present the draft convention on youth rights at the 10th Forum of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and also to submit for consideration the issue of establishment of the institution of a special rapporteur on youth rights. Fifthly, jointly with the International Labour Organization and the World Bank, we have established a significant work in terms of eradicating forced and child labor. This is one of the main achievements of our reforms. In this International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, we will adopt the law on the Children's Ombudsman. Sixth, we propose to hold, together with the United Nations High Commissioner's Office, a global forum dedicated to the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. In order to develop human rights education system, we intend to make our contribution to the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Human Rights. Seventh, we support the proposal by the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to take decisive steps to reduce the number of stateless persons. Last year alone, 50,000 of our compatriots acquired citizenship of Uzbekistan, and this year, more than 20,000 people will also obtain it. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we intend further to develop civil society institutions and continue improvements in this field, as well as providing comprehensive support to freedom of speech in Uzbekistan. The preparation of codes on non-governmental, non-profit organizations and mass media will continue. We take into consideration the United Nations Special Rapporteur's recommendations on such issues as freedom of religion or belief, as well as on the independence of judges and lawyers. We suggest that the Council consider the issue of developing universal principles on judicial councils. As part of introducing the national mechanism for the prevention of torture, we will continue strictly to suppress all forms of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. Such crimes shall not have a statute of limitations. We intend to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. For joint work on these issues, we intend to invite the Special Rapporteur on Torture to Uzbekistan. Distinguished participants, Uzbekistan is firmly committed to its international human rights obligations. In this context, we understand that we are only at the beginning of the road, and we count on the support of our international partners. In this regard, we are expecting a visit from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to our country and intend to take a decision to extend a standing invitation to all mandate holders to visit Uzbekistan. We also intend to contribute to the creation of a mechanism for ensuring human rights in the Asia region on the basis of a permanent platform, the Samarkand Forum. Dear friends, the 75 years of United Nations history have convincingly proved the universal value of human rights. Without them, peace, security, and sustainable development would be impossible. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize once again that Uzbekistan, as a member of the Human Rights Council, will protect and actively promote the universal principles and norms of international human rights law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ivan Duque Marquez, President of Colombia. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Saludo al Secretario General de la Nación.
I would like to greet the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. Also the President of the Human Rights Council, Nayat Shaminkan, and the Federal Councillor of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, Ignacio Cassis. As well as the more than 70 representatives that participate in the 46th period of sessions of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's a great pleasure for me to share the developments our country has recently had regarding human rights. Most of them were achieved thanks to your contribution to the common faith in multilateralism. As is well known, Colombia has welcomed in brotherhood and solidarity close to 2 million Venezuelan migrants who are in our country having fled the tragedy caused by the Maduro dictatorship. As Colombians, we do not forget that it was a Venezuelan, of course, who led our independence, joining forever the destiny of our countries. They offered us their hand in the past, and today we are supporting those who are escaping hunger and lack of opportunities as part of the worst humanitarian crisis in the hemisphere. As further evidence of that commitment, on the 8th of February, we launched the temporary status for protection of Venezuelan migrants, with which we try to regularise their status and integrate them into our system. This decision was recorded by the UNHCR as the most important humanitarian gesture that has ever been made since 1984, when the Cartagena Declaration was signed. Further, we received support from José Ángel Gurría, the Secretary General of the OECD, Antony Blinken, the State Secretary of the United States, and the international community as a whole. We are grateful for this support, and we call on other states to adopt similar measures to bring about a robust response with which to ensure that the rights of the most vulnerable are guaranteed. In Colombia, we recognise the Human Rights Council as a form of great importance, and we support the international fact-finding mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Its first report confirmed a stark reality: the systematic attack of the regime against all kinds of opposition through enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial killings, etc. We trust that the mission will lead to establishing accountability. The international community cannot remain indifferent at these heinous crimes that affect not only the victims themselves, but all humanity. Now, 2020, of course, has put us face to face with an unprecedented crisis, which has challenged our living conditions and our values. In Colombia, we face this crisis openly with a human rights-based approach. Due to the pandemic, in light of the pandemic, we've tried to strengthen our healthcare system and help the most vulnerable, create cash flow for families and companies, and protect the labour market. We set up the National Vaccination Plan against COVID-19, through which we will immunise 35 million people, 70% of the Colombian population, and this will contribute to herd immunity. I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight that there must be more solidarity from the international community to guarantee fair access to these vaccines, especially for the most vulnerable populations. These challenging times have confirmed that it's only through global action that we will have more opportunities to overcome the main struggle we're facing today, namely fair and safe access to vaccines. There are winds of hope blowing in Colombia due to the implementation of the peace and legality policy that during 2020 saw progress in transforming territories most affected by violence and poverty. Thanks to the support of the international community, the private sector and others, we're bringing security where there was terror and options for a better life where there was desolation. In 2020, we managed to achieve the lowest rate of homicides in 46 years, the lowest rate of abductions since there are registers, and the highest rate of cocaine hydrochloride seizure, and the eradication of more than 130,000 illicit crops. In addition, through the development plans with territorial focus, the PDET, as they're called, 1,000 social, community, road and utilities infrastructure works have been made to benefit 139,000 vulnerable families. The victims are our priority, and therefore we extended for 10 years the law that seeks to provide remedy to them so that it fully fulfills its mission. And we also advanced in our care for the almost 9 million victims. Regarding the demobilised that have decided to return to live within the framework of the law, we have provided support for more than 13,000 of them for their reintegration. 98% now are in the banking system and have joined the healthcare system, and 83% have also started to contribute to the pension system. On the other hand, it's fundamental for us to protect human rights defenders, and so we fight with determination illegal armed groups who are the main perpetrators of the crimes against them. There are important challenges, of course, in this sphere, but we must say that the progress made through the PDET, the comprehensive action of the state, and the robust action of the law enforcement services have allowed us to be more efficient. Up to now, 53% of the cases verified by Michelle Bachelet's office have seen developments in crime solving, and 49% of the people protected in the country are social leaders or human rights defenders. We're openly sharing the achievements and challenges we face because Colombia has always been happy to be exposed to international scrutiny. We don't hide our challenges or difficulties, but we positively are open to the recommendations made to promote human rights in the country. Hence, the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office is in Colombia since 1996 with 23 agencies, funds and UN programmes. I asked the Secretary-General to renew the mandate of the verification mission until 2022 and to broaden its scope to include transitional justice in order to guarantee remedy, truth, justice and non-repetition. I reiterate our commitment to human rights and to this very much valued council, and I guarantee that we will support all initiatives that seek to improve its credibility and efficacy for the benefit of all our peoples. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honour to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gitanas Nausėda, President of Lithuania. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address you at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Let me use this opportunity to express my deepest respect for human rights as a precondition for peace and security. The very existence of the United Nations is based on the imperative to protect peace, human rights, and justice, to ensure stability and social progress globally. Lithuania finds the Council of Human Rights to be of great importance for enhancing cooperation and promoting human rights. It inspires us to work on protecting human rights, identifying vulnerabilities, and addressing them. I disagree with those who say that we must focus merely on the implementation of human rights norms. There are too many people now who cannot enjoy their rights because of new challenges or emerging protection gaps. Nobody should be left behind. Human rights are universal, indivisible, and inherent to every human being. It's unfortunately true that we are being routinely confronted with violations of human rights in many places of the world. There are a few words to be said about the current situation in Lithuania's immediate neighborhood. More than 6 months have passed since the fraudulent presidential election in our neighboring country. All this time, security forces have been applying brutal mass violence against peaceful protesters, political opposition, civil society journalists, and media workers. Such brutalities should be addressed by international organizations. Investigations of the violations of human rights must be carried out. Accountability mechanisms for the human rights violations must be elaborated. We are also taking note of many recent human rights violations. The poisoning attempt and subsequent incarceration of and trial of Alexei Navalny, the politically motivated trial against human rights defender and historian Yuri Dmitriev, and many other examples paint a rather grim picture. To this, we should also add actions ongoing in the illegally annexed Crimea, in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine, as well as in the occupied Georgia's regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Lithuania calls to end systematic violations of the international law and to cooperate with the United Nations mechanism. There are always those who attempt to defend these actions, talking about matters of supposedly purely internal or domestic concern. However, it should be clear that there is no way to selectively apply the human rights doctrine. Our duty calls on us to ensure that all victims get effective protection and redress. All perpetrators must be brought to justice. Let me assure you that Lithuania will always support a strong human rights pillar of the United Nations. We participate eagerly in all the efforts to sustain the freedom of peaceful assembly and association worldwide. In 2014-2015, while acting as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, Lithuania had spoken out for media freedom and protection of civilians in armed conflicts. We also promoted the rule of law, as well as gender equality and women empowerment. Currently, my country is running for a seat on the Human Rights Council in 2022-24. If elected, Lithuania will give attention to the promotion of rights of those most vulnerable, children, people with disabilities, human rights defenders, and people living in conflict situations. We will also continue our ongoing activities in the promotion of the rights of the women and girls, the safety of journalists, freedoms of expression, as well as of assembly and association, freedom of religion and belief, and the inclusion of civil society in the Council's agenda. Lithuania will seek that this Council makes a real difference on the ground. We are also determined to research for solutions that would be acceptable to all parties involved. To support human rights worldwide, we will also need broad cooperation. The recent decision made by the United States of America to rejoin the Council as an observer with the intention to seek full membership is therefore a welcome development. As the current chair of the executive board of the UNICEF, Lithuania is also keen to work that no child is left behind. Empowering children by ensuring equal access to quality education is a key element of good future for the whole of humanity. We should also pay close attention to persons with disabilities, who often face multiple forms of discrimination. There should be strong efforts to take steps in adjusting our policies and raising awareness. Our main goal is to address the needs of persons with disabilities, achieving their full social integration. Lithuania will also continue to support human rights defenders, for we strongly believe that their activities are the cornerstone of free and democratic societies. There are too many disturbing instances of killings, death threats, and other forms of intimidation against human rights defenders. All governments should live up to their moral and legal obligation to prevent such crimes. To protect the rights of the people living in conflict areas, we need viable political solutions addressing the root causes of a specific conflict. The international community has a crucial role to play in mediating, negotiating, and implementing peaceful agreements. Finally, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, will be to strengthen the rule of law on a global scale. Without it, the human rights regime could always fall prey to dangerous destabilization and erosion. So let us work together, promote the rule of law, and build a better future for all people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mohammad Ashraf Ghani, President of Afghanistan. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, Madam President Nizhat Shamim Khan, Your Excellency Ambassador Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, Excellency Madam Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I'd like to congratulate you, Madam President, for assuming the presidency of the 15th cycle of the Human Rights Council and wish you and the Bureau a successful year ahead. It is an honor to address the Human Rights Council to reaffirm Afghanistan's unwavering commitment to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms, as well as our unequivocal support to the noble mandate of the Council, the UN human rights mechanisms, and the activities of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We, the people of the United Nations, meet in the context of unprecedented global turbulence. COVID-19, the changing nature of violence and war, climate change, the fourth industrial revolution, and transformation of technology, and the explosion of inequality, each constitute a distinctive form of disruptive change. Their simultaneous occurrence and entangled interactions produce a hyperphenomenon, marking a break between our assumptions, routines, and habits of the past. Confronting our collective global challenge requires a global review, similar to the imagination and cooperation that give us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, and the Bretton Woods institutions. The scale and scope of the challenges facing our interconnected world bear on every article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, requiring review and restatement. The question is not the enduring relevance of the vision but issues arising from success and the radical change in context. Human rights are almost universally accepted, as reflected in the constitutions of most of the countries of the world. Respecting may be a different matter, reflecting the degree to which the processes of state building and market building have been citizen-focused and rights-based. The challenge now is renewal of global consensus on moving from the discourse of human rights to the practice of human rights, hence the urgency of exploring the impact of the 5 drivers of global turbulence in relation to renewal of commitment to the preamble that the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The foundational right for us, the Afghan people and government, is the right to peace. Subject to 40 years of violence, the right that we yearn for most is the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person within a sovereign, democratic, and united country. The toll on our livelihood and lives has been immense. The World Bank estimated the material loss between 1978 and 2001 at $240 billion. The human loss is commonly estimated at 1.5 million killed, 2 million internally displaced, and 9 million forced to become refugees. The scale and scope of suffering continues. The Global Terrorism Index, to take one example, estimates the damage inflicted by the Taliban on our GDP in 2019 at 18.6%. Afghan refugees still living in Iran and Pakistan are estimated at 5 million respectively. The number of disabled is 152,000 and internally displaced at 400,000. Mere numbers do not capture the extent of our tragedy. The recent wave of violence against our people, civil and civic institutions, from human rights and civil society organizations to the media, judicial, civil service, and security organizations to farmers and traders are indications of a systematic onslaught against our society. Targeted killings are the sharp edge directed against men and women, representing the profound transformation of our society during the last 20 years. Its issue is not just the continuous nature of violence inflicted upon us during the past 40 years. Even worse is the phenomena of unrestricted warfare. Colonels Xiao Liang and Wang Jiangshu argued in 1999 that warfare will soon, I quote, transcend all boundaries and limits. The battlefield would be everywhere, and the boundaries lying between the two worlds of war and non-war, of military and non-military, will be totally destroyed, end of quote. Tragically, their prediction has become a reality. We, the people of Afghanistan, suffer on a daily basis from the effects of unrestricted warfare. What becomes of the promise of Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Clearly, the institution of post-World War II have proven inadequate to preventing the recurrence of the barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. The answer, however, surely does not lie in discarding the universal acceptance of human rights. As Rosa Brooks argues, the best route to upholding human rights and the rule of law lies in recognizing that war and peace are not binary opposites, but lie along a continuum. We can accept the word as it is, but change the categories we use to make sense of it, and develop new rules and institutions to manage the paradox of perpetual war. When we developed our first constitution in 1923, we were the only fully sovereign country in the Muslim world. The discourse of rights and obligations enshrined in our first constitution was developed by a remarkable group of scholars from Afghanistan, India, and the Ottoman Empire, reflecting a century of state building within the dominant norms of Islamic thought and practice. Our current constitution of 2004, enshrining a clear commitment to the principles of human rights, respect both for the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights builds on the cultural foundations of our first constitution and our Islamic beliefs, culture, and civilization. The rights of citizens articulated in Chapter 2 of our Constitution are not moral injunctions, but fundamental rights constituting the constitutive and regulative rules of the state, society, and economy in the interrelations and check and balances of three branches of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Despite the intensity of violence, Afghan citizens, men and women, girls and boys, old and young, rural and urban, religious scholars and civil society activists have found common ground in the categories of citizenship in the Republic as enshrined in the Constitution. Accountability for, adherence to, and respect for human rights, therefore, is not grounded in responding to external pressures, but flow from a rich and lively set of agreements and disagreements among equal citizens, making our history and attempting to secure our future through overcoming our tragic past. I'll spare you the numbers, as the UNAMA reports both document our efforts and our challenges. I can, however, categorically state that the majority of our citizens, fully 70.6% of whom are under the age of 30, are now not only familiar with the notions of fundamental rights, but frame their dialogue and demands from their government as citizens empowered by the Constitution. Achieving peace is our national quest. There's a national consensus on the end state of a sovereign, democratic, united Afghanistan, at peace within and with the world, and capable of preserving and expanding the achievements of the past 20 years. We are in a historically rare moment when a just and lasting peace can be achieved through a political settlement. The Afghan people and the government have the commitment, conviction, and courage to demonstrate the sense of urgency required in such an open moment. Difficult choices will have to be made to move from being a battlefield of unrestricted warfare to a platform of an Asian roundabout and international cooperation. Human rights in general and rights of citizens, women, girls, youth, and social categories, in particular, are going to figure prominently in the peace negotiations. What would be the advice of the human rights community and the stand of the Human Rights Council? We ask for your early engagement and constructive partnership to secure for a generation of Afghans bearing the scars of war and the future generations that can enjoy the rights of peace. If war and peace constitute a continuum today, surely moving from the purgatory of unrestricted warfare to lasting peace is worth the marshalling of all of our collective energies and imagination. We, the Afghan people and government, are placing our peacemaking efforts within a framework of international and regional partnerships around the aligned processes of state building, market building, and state building to reinforce our shared destiny as a unified nation. The Independent Human Rights Commission of Afghanistan is a constitution-based national human rights institution fully and robustly functioning according to the Paris Principles. It has consistently maintained its A status rating. The government of Afghanistan fully respects and cherishes the independence and impartial conduct of our National Human Rights Commission when we are committed to increase our financial contribution without restrictions. Finally, Madam President, in the last 3 years, as a member of this Council, Afghanistan improved and enhanced cooperation with the international human rights mechanisms. We paid serious attention to our commitments and pledges made during our candidacy. Under my direct instructions, the government of Afghanistan submitted 6 initial and periodic reports on the implementation of core human rights conventions, some overdue since Afghanistan first acceded to them decades ago. We also presented our 3rd cycle UPR report, and we are tirelessly working towards the implementation of the recommendations received during the review. Afghanistan will continue to closely cooperate with the with the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mechanism. As a Council member, we prioritize the areas where a significant protection and global attention gap existed and contributed to filling the gap, including the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. Using experiences from this very first term, Afghanistan is willing and committed to serve and continue to build on its legacy of constructive engagement as a member for another term in 2023-25, for which we seek your support and cooperation. Excellencies, distinguished participants, at the end, once again, let me thank you for the opportunity. At a moment in history where the combined impact of disruptive forces puts into question the near universal acceptance of human rights, we need to work together to preserve the gains of the past by taking account of the changed context and offer updated rule of law and human rights frameworks that can result in furthering the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Afghanistan will be a steady partner in this journey of faith and imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Andrzej Duda, President of Poland. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to address the Human Rights Council. Let me begin by congratulating Her Excellency Ambassador Nazet Shemin-Khan of Fiji to her appointment as President of the Human Rights Council. Madam, I wish you every success in steering the Council. I would also like to commend the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Michelle Bachelet, and her office for their dedication to advance the human rights standards. Let me assure you, Madam High Commissioner, that in Poland you have a strong ally and a dedicated partner. Excellencies, the times we are navigating through are challenging. The situation of human rights is not getting better. On the contrary, a lot needs to be done. The spread of COVID-19 and our attempts to contain the virus is the most pressing challenge to the international community. The pandemic has shown that no society or country, poor or rich, and no part of the world is immune to its negative impact and spillover effects. But the consequences of the pandemic are even more serious. First, COVID-19 has raised the issue of healthcare, public health and health security to the level of basic human rights. Second, we cannot allow for the pandemic to contribute to an even greater exclusions in the world, to a division between rich and poor. And last but not least, the fact that for more than a year now, most of the attention has been paid to combating COVID-19 does not mean that other problems have magically disappeared. Quite the opposite. The situation in many parts of the world keeps worsening as we speak. Today, I would like to concentrate on a few most urgent issues. As a head of the state located in Central Europe, I want to draw your attention to the situation in countries that border my country, Poland, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. It must be underlined that following presidential elections in their homeland, thousands of Belarusians took to the streets to exercise their basic democratic rights. The scale of repressions of the Belarusian regime that followed was more than alarming. In that regard, the international community cannot remain silent. Every country has to fulfill its obligations under the international human rights law. I call on the Belarusian authorities to move away from the policy of oppression to the policy of dialogue. Sadly, Belarus is not the only country in our region whose authorities follow a path of political repression against its society. This has been clearly presented by the Russian Federation in massive detentions of peaceful protesters who had gathered to express their support for Alexei Navalny and his co-workers. They are not known by their names, and their fate remains unknown in many cases, but we can judge from experience that it might be tragic. Restoration of the business-as-usual approach to Russia and expecting it would influence the Kremlin's behavior is naive. It's not what proper dialogue means. Proper dialogue implies that certain standards have to be upheld. And in case of Russia, these standards are not improving. They are deteriorating. I call upon the Russian authorities to realize its international obligations and therefore release Alexei Navalny and his detained supporters. The international community should also continue paying close attention to the dire situation of human rights in the territories of Ukraine being under control of Russian occupation forces or Russia-backed separatists. Poland clearly reconfirms its support for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. Esteemed colleagues, turning to the religious persecution, it has to be stressed that freedom of religion or belief is one of the basic human rights and needs to be protected worldwide. The violation of this fundamental right should be addressed by the international community more efficiently. Poland has been particularly concerned by the increasing phenomenon of discrimination against and religious persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. As a result, on August 22nd, 2019, on Poland's initiative, the General Assembly adopted the resolution titled International Day commemorating the victims of acts of violence based on religion or belief. Poland also remains committed to protecting vulnerable groups, including children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. We must stand up for those who will not be able to stand up for themselves. We must strive for solidarity. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of expression is the last issue I would like to highlight today. It being referred to as the first freedom, we must make sure that in the area of digital revolution, it remains so. Therefore, the task ahead of us is to build an open public sphere in the digital domain. Excellencies, to conclude, I want to assure you that as a member of the Human Rights Council, Poland will continue the mission it started during the membership in the UN Security Council. We seek a world based on the force of law and not the law of force. And we will engage with all stakeholders who share our vision. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Nicolás Maduro Moros, President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm very pleased to seize this opportunity and to attend on behalf of the people of Venezuela this important session of the Human Rights Council. The serious and unexpected circumstances brought about by COVID-19 and which humanity is facing call for greater commitment from global leaders in order to forge a better, shared and joint future for everyone. The COVID-19 pandemic has cost the lives of 2,400,000 people, and more than 109 million people have contracted the virus. This has exacerbated social injustice and inequalities. An emergency of this scale has shown the need to consider public health as a fundamental human right. Multilateralism is showing that it is the only way forward in order to overcome global challenges and in order to establish better living conditions for our peoples. Therefore, we would like to acknowledge the guidance provided by the World Health Organization, which managed to achieve coordination between states, thus averting an even greater tragedy. Venezuela has managed to mitigate and control the pandemic thanks to a pre-existing social policy in the field of our free and good quality public health, as well as our social security policies, and by implementing biosecurity methodologies that are based on citizen participation. We have also applied complementary and combined scientific treatments, which we humbly bring before member states. This has not been easy. Our country is grappling with a multidimensional war geared towards ending the inclusive social model that was established by the Bolivarian Republic. Excessive pressure, persecution against our country through more than 450 unilateral coercive measures, illegal unilateral coercive measures, which have resulted in a blockade and an obsessive persecution against our states and our society's capacities. Wrongly termed as sanctions, these have meant that Venezuela has been deprived of at least $30 billion in cash. These are part of Venezuela's assets abroad. They are resources which should be used to ensure the health, food security and comprehensive rights of our people. Those who have abducted the Venezuelan state's assets and resources have shown great cruelty, including against the backdrop of a pandemic. They have disregarded the calls of the international community, the calls of the UN Secretary General, of the High Commissioner, and, above all, of the Venezuelan people. And they have stepped up economic acts of aggression, thus triggering a humanitarian crisis maliciously and intentionally. But despite these very hostile circumstances, we have made great efforts to uphold the Bolivarian welfare state, which has been severely jeopardized by these illegal, unilateral and coercive sanctions. But we will not halt our programs aimed at ensuring the social security of our Venezuelan people. With this in mind, we have stepped up our cooperation with the UN system, and we have done so in a comprehensive way with all of its specialized bodies, programs and funds. Madam President, the Venezuelan government renewed in September 2020 the Memorandum of Understanding for another year, Memorandum of Understanding with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We did this to continue strengthening the bonds of cooperation and technical assistance for protecting and promoting human rights in Venezuela. Let me reiterate that the Venezuelan state will work decisively with the actors of this Human Rights Council I can also assure you that we will not accept the interference or intervention of any inquisitive mechanism against our fatherland, a mechanism which would usurp the just cause of human rights as a political tool in order to bring about a change of government, to force a change of regime in our country. Those who believe that Venezuela will diminish its cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as a consequence of these ideological provocations waged by a group of governments are very wrong. Madam President, I would like to inform Member States that a few days ago, Dr. Aliana Douhan finished her visit to Venezuela. Dr. Douhan is the Special Rapporteur on the negative consequences of unilateral coercive measures which have systematically been applied against the Venezuelan people. Dr. Aliana Douhan held a large number of meetings. She met with multiple political, business and social stakeholders to discuss the reality in Venezuela. The conclusions contained in her preliminary report are compelling in that they show that the sanctions and unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States and the EU as a tool to bring about a change of regime in Venezuela are a blatant violation of international law and of all the universal and regional human rights instruments that exist. The report recognizes specifically that these extraterritorial actions are an attempt against the life of the Venezuelan people, and they threaten their full enjoyment of the economic and social rights that have been democratically achieved over the last 2 decades. The rapporteur called for the sanctions against Venezuela to be lifted, for its assets to be returned to it, and for the guarantees for Venezuela to access its safeguards, which have been illegally frozen, to be restored, and to ensure access of Venezuela to the global financial system. This is the cry coming from almost 30 million Venezuelans who have been victims of these unilateral, illegal, coercive measures, victims of this multidimensional economic aggression. Madam President, despite this campaign against Venezuelan democracy and despite the boycotts orchestrated by Washington and Bogota, on the 6th of December 2020, the Venezuelan people elected its new National Assembly, that is, its new legislative body, from among almost 14,000 candidates, male and female, belonging to 107 political organizations representing all political and ideological stripes in our country. The election day took place very smoothly, and the new parliamentary body is already legislating in order to further safeguard the political guarantees of the Venezuelan people. We would like to reiterate our call for the right of peoples to self-determination to be respected. And we call for efforts to strengthen multilateralism and for a multipolar world without hegemony. We also would like to reaffirm our commitment to achieving the SDGs. No aggression will divert our country from this noble goal. The liberator Simón Bolívar, the liberator of America, asserted 200 years ago that the most perfect system of government is one which provides the highest degree of happiness to its citizens, the highest level of social security, and the highest degree of political stability. That is what we believe. And we urge all of the stakeholders of the Human Rights Council and the United Nations system to make these our principles throughout the UN system. Let us together ensure the happiness, safety and stability of humanity. Let us change this system of predatory capitalist economic organization which has caused so much pain, death, so many wars and so much misery. As we think ahead to the future of our species, nothing is impossible. Let us build a system of justice and fairness on the pillars of human rights and respect for social rights and international law. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Human Rights Council. Madam President, thank you.
Thank you. I now have the honour to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Sanna Marin, Prime Minister of Finland. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to address the United Nations Human Rights Council today. Finland wishes to join this council as a full member during the 22-24 term. I am proud of our candidacy. For Finland, a strong, rules-based multilateral system is of fundamental importance. The Human Rights Council is a cornerstone of this system that plays a key role in upholding our dignity and human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic affects us all. The need for solidarity and resilience has once again become very concrete. Based on our experience, inclusive societies are better able to adapt to change and overcome crisis. Finland's own history is telling. Our development from a poor agrarian country into a stable, equal and prosperous nation has not always been easy. Gender equality and quality education for all have made our success possible. We have built our society by including everyone and by placing human rights, fundamental freedoms and equality at the very center. Today I want to focus on the rights of women and girls, climate change and digital space and human rights. We have seen a pushback on women's and girls' rights in many countries. Discrimination and violence have increased. We all must do more to fight against the trafficking of women and girls and offer better support to victims in each of our countries and globally. Sexual and gender-based violence is still used as a weapon in conflicts, repression and ethnic cleansing. We are deeply concerned about what we are hearing from the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas and from Tigray. The COVID-19 pandemic is worsening the situation of countless health and social workers who are mostly women. Intimate partner violence has become the so-called shadow pandemic. In Finland too, we have seen an increase in domestic violence. Globally, sexual and reproductive health and rights are more and more at risk. At the same time, women are a powerful force for change and recovery. This council is key in ensuring progress on women's and girls' rights and in building back better. Second, I want to underline the severe impacts of climate change and the enjoyment of human rights. We have a duty to prevent the negative effects of climate change. We must work to achieve a just and fair transition. In doing so, we must pay special attention to the rights of persons in the most vulnerable situations, including persons with disabilities and indigenous peoples. In order to combat climate change, we need everyone on board. Globally, empowering women and girls can be decisive in making a real change at every level. Third, I want to focus on digital space and human rights. Digitalization must become a force for the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms as it is changing the way the world works. With this in mind, it is essential that we bridge the digital divide. Finland wants to promote a safe digital space for all and to enable everyone to use their voices without the threat of violence, harassment or hate speech. Freedoms of expression, assembly and media are essential for democratic government. Further, the accountability of decision makers lies at the very heart of democracy, as does the rule of law. I am deeply concerned about the recent attempts in many countries to limit citizens' rights to peacefully express their views both online and offline. I'm particularly worried about attacks against human rights defenders, LGBTI persons and members of civil society. We cannot allow authoritarian governments to use internet and media shutdowns as a political tool. We are extremely concerned about shrinking space for civil society in many authoritarian countries, including on our own continent. Finland also strongly condemns the mistreatment of representatives of the political opposition and other peaceful protesters we have witnessed recently. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, no country has a perfect human rights record. We all have work to do.